61. That is the number the American public was given. 61 men killed on a remote hilltop in South Vietnam in the summer of 1970, after 3 weeks of fighting, before the survivors packed up and pulled out. The losses, they were told, had been light. For 15 years, that clean little figure was almost all anyone knew. It was wrong. Every paratrooper knows a ripcord is the cord that saves your life at the last second. And the men of the 101st Airborne gave that name to the firebase they built on that hill. It would turn out to be the cruelest kind of irony. The hill is officially Hill 927, the flattened upper half of it still bald and patched with old runway matting from an earlier base. The 1st Cavalry opened it in 1968. The Screaming Eagles took it over and renamed it Ripcord in 1969. By 1970, it sits at the center of an ambitious plan. The North Vietnamese have spent the rainy season stocking their supply caches in the mountains northeast of the A Shau Valley, a place American troops call the warehouse area for all the weapons and rice pulled out of it over the years. The 101st intends to preempt them with a major offensive codenamed Operation Chicago Peak, and Ripcord is to be the firebase that anchors it. Take the hill, fill it with artillery, and from there reach into the enemy's strongholds before he can move down into the lowlands. The trouble starts before the base is even finished. Lieutenant Colonel Andre Lucas and his 2nd Battalion 506th Infantry, the 2 506th, are ordered to seize the ridge where Ripcord will stand. 2 air assaults onto the hill are turned back with heavy casualties. The site is finally secured only by a ground attack on the 11th of April. That difficulty is a warning, and it goes unheeded. The base sits in a bowl of higher ground. To the west looms Hill 1000, which looks straight down onto Ripcord and dominates it completely. Whoever holds the surrounding peaks controls the firebase, and through the spring the Americans do not. For weeks the enemy seems to vanish. When the monsoon breaks in mid-May and the sky fills again with scout ships and gunships, contact drops off, and it is tempting to believe the North Vietnamese have pulled back. They have not. They are avoiding contact, which is not difficult in those mountains, and while they avoid it, they are doing something methodical. They are encircling Ripcord. American observers will only understand this in hindsight, once the shelling begins, that for weeks the enemy has been sitting in the high ground counting helicopters, marking landing zones, and registering mortars on every position on the hill. The base believes it is hunting. It is being surrounded. The clearest warning comes from the men who slip closest to the enemy. In the last days of June, a long-range reconnaissance team working the valleys around Ripcord stumbles onto a field telephone line strung along a trail, and the line is not American. Rather than pull back, the team is handed a tape recorder and a set of alligator clips and ordered to tap it. For most of 4 days, from the 29th of June to the 2nd of July, the recon soldiers lie hidden on a hillside above the wire, swapping tapes with a helicopter each morning, certain they will have their throats cut before they are relieved. The line yields only the discipline of an army that does not expect to be overheard. The mountains around the firebase are not empty. They are an occupied zone, and the occupiers are settling in for something large. On the morning of the 1st of July 1970, the encirclement announces itself. The first mortar rounds come down on Ripcord, and they keep coming. This is not harassment. It is the opening move of a siege that the enemy has prepared with patience, and from this point forward the initiative belongs entirely to them. Having seized it, they keep it for 23 days. The firebase answers in kind. Ripcord's perimeter is shaped like a figure 8. The 105 mm howitzers crowded onto the higher southeast half of the hill, the heavier 155S on a lower tier to the northwest, and the moment the incoming starts, the gun crews are slamming rounds back onto the pre-plotted grids where enemy mortars are likely hidden. Within minutes, scout helicopters and rocket-firing Cobra gunships are circling overhead, hunting the mortar pits dug into the surrounding peaks. On paper it is a one-sided contest, far more steel coming down on the enemy than he is throwing up at the hill. But that is exactly the trap. The North Vietnamese mortars are dug into reverse slopes the artillery cannot reach, and the aircraft can only glimpse, and they do not need to win the duel. They need only to keep it going day after day until the hill cannot be sustained. The shape of the battle is dictated by a single vulnerability, and the enemy has identified it precisely. Ripcord cannot be supplied by road. There are no roads. Every shell, every sandbag, every can of water and crate of rations has to be flown in by helicopter, and every wounded man has to be flown out the same way. Cut the helicopters and the base dies on its own, no assault required. So the North Vietnamese ring the approaches with mortars and heavy machine guns and turn the airspace over Ripcord into a gauntlet. They do not have to overrun the hill. They only have to make landing on it lethal. This is the quiet intelligence of the siege, and it is the kind of thing that never appears in a casualty figure. The defenders can win every firefight on the perimeter and still lose the base, starved one downed helicopter at a time. The men who carry the weight of that arithmetic are the air crews, and what they do over Ripcord deserves its own recognition. Every resupply run is a decision to fly a slow, loaded machine into airspace the enemy has zeroed, knowing the .51 caliber machine guns on the surrounding peaks are waiting. The pilots do it anyway, again and again, because the men on the hill cannot last without them. This was, in fact, the oldest danger in the Airshow. When the 1st Cavalry first fought its way into the valley in 1968, the anti-aircraft fire was so murderous, 10 helicopters shot down in a matter of days, that the American command imposed a news blackout on the entire operation rather than let the losses reach the public. The valley had been swallowing aircraft and being quietly hushed up for 2 years before Ripcord. The Firebase was simply the place where both of those patterns reached their peak at once. The real killing, though, is not on the Firebase. It is on the hills around it, where American companies fight to hold the high ground that protects the approaches, and the enemy fights to take it. This is the part of Ripcord the word siege can hide. It is not men huddled under a bombardment. It is a series of vicious battles for individual peaks, each one a piece of terrain that controls a line of fire into the base. Nowhere is the problem clearer than on Hill 1000, the dominating mass to the west, where the enemy has dug mortars into the crest that neither artillery nor airstrikes can silence. On the 6th day of the siege, a 6-man reconnaissance team works its way up the slope until it can hear the enemy crews talking 400 meters above and radios the exact grid coordinates back to the base. The team offers to adjust artillery onto the position. The answer that comes back over the radio is an order to assault it instead, a handful of men against an entrenched mortar crew and the infantry guarding it. The recon soldiers think the order is madness, and say so. The order stands. It is a small moment, but it captures the impossible logic the defenders are caught inside. The high ground has to be taken, but the force needed to take it properly is exactly what the army has decided it can no longer spend. That is the strange new rule shaping everything. Colonel Benjamin Harrison, the brigade commander, instinctively wants to meet force with overwhelming counterforce, the way the army always has. Division headquarters refuses to be drawn into that kind of slugging match. When the attacks on Hill 1000 fail, there is great hesitation about renewing them, even though that ground is vital. When a company seizes a fortified hill to the southeast on the 12th day, then bleeds itself repelling 5 straight night attacks, it is not replaced with a fresh company when it is pulled out to recover. The enemy simply takes the hill back. The 101st cannot afford another hamburger hill, and the enemy, who can afford almost any losses, knows it. The army is also fighting itself in a quieter way, and Ripcord exposes it. Under a policy meant to spread combat experience around the officer corps, company commanders are rotated out after 6 months, whether or not the men under them want to lose them. In practice, the rule has hardened into a career mechanism, a box that ambitious officers need to check, and it pulls seasoned commanders off the line at the worst possible moments. In the weeks before the siege, one of the battalion's companies loses its commander, a hard, brilliant veteran of 2 wars whom his men regarded as nearly immortal, to a desk job as a supply officer the day his 6 months are up. His replacement, an earnest but green captain, lasts barely 2 weeks before a sapper attack in the dark kills him along with much of his command post on terrain that should have favored the defenders. The lesson is brutal and institutional. The men who knew how to keep soldiers alive were being cycled out by a system designed around careers rather than survival, and at Ripcord the bill for that came due in lives. The slow strangulation has a rhythm, and by the middle of July it is accelerating. On the 17th day, the enemy brings up powerful 120 mm mortars, the heaviest yet, and the shelling worsens. Then comes the moment the entire siege had been building toward. On the 18th of July, a resupply Chinook hovers over the hill with a sling load of artillery shells, and a burst of anti-aircraft fire punches into its fuel tank. The helicopter drops straight down into the ammunition storage area of one of the howitzer batteries. The crash sets off the stored shells, and the explosions that follow do not merely damage the position, they blow the top off the hill. One battery is completely destroyed. Burning jet fuel runs down into the communications center and sets it ablaze. White phosphorus shells cook off and scatter burning chunks across the base, starting more fires, while tear gas from exploding gas rounds drifts down into the command bunkers. For days afterward, Ripcord has to lean on neighboring fire bases to survive, because in a matter of minutes it has lost much of the ammunition it had fought so hard to bring in. It is the single clearest proof of the enemy's whole design. One lucky burst of anti-aircraft fire, aimed not at the men but at the machine bringing them what they needed, had done more damage than any infantry assault could have. It is in this period of maximum pressure that the battle takes the life of the one man whose name would, decades later, draw the public toward Ripcord, though for reasons that have nothing to do with how he died. First Lieutenant Bob Kalsu is an artillery officer, acting commander of a 155 mm battery, and before the war he was a professional football player, the Buffalo Bills Rookie of the Year, one of only a handful of pro athletes who interrupted their careers to serve in Vietnam. On the firebase he is something rarer than a celebrity. He is the officer who hauls ammunition alongside his enlisted men, which simply was not done. On the 21st of July, the enemy drops a heavy salvo of mortars onto the battery, hoping to catch the crew's moving shells that a Chinook has just delivered. Kalsu is standing at the top of the stairs leading down into his fire direction center, talking with a pathfinder named Nick Photius. He is telling Photius that his wife, pregnant with their second child, is due to deliver that very day. Then an 82 mm round slams in about 5 feet from the entrance. Photius survived, and what he remembered is the kind of thing the released figures never captured. "I put my hand up there and tried to stop the blood," Photius recalled, "and then I realized I was holding a piece of his brain in my hand." Kalsu was killed instantly, alongside 2 of his men. His second child, a son, was born 2 days after he died. He remains the only professional athlete killed in the Vietnam War, and his death sent a shock across the hill that even Lucas, hardened as he was, could not hide. He was not the only name on Ripcord that would later carry an echo. Among the dead is Vyland Norris, brother of the actor Chuck Norris. But the point is not the famous names. The point is that the men dying on that hill were ordinary soldiers, mostly young draftees, and their deaths, if the cameras had been present, would have produced exactly the reckoning the administration was determined to prevent. Keeping that reckoning from happening was, by now, the governing logic of the entire battle. By the 3rd week, the situation has slipped beyond what determination can fix. The base is ringed by an enemy that intelligence now estimates at 6 battalions, drawn mostly from the 6th and 803rd North Vietnamese regiments, with a 3rd regiment somewhere out in the mountains, unlocated. A company tapping into an enemy landline south of the firebase finds itself listening to a division headquarters talking to its subordinate units, and a map taken from a dead soldier confirms what everyone fears. An assault on Ripcord is coming. The comparison hanging over the hill is one no American commander wants to say aloud. In 1954, a French garrison let itself be surrounded in a remote valley called Dien Bien Phu, confident it could be supplied by air and that its firepower would shatter any attack. The Viet Minh took the high ground, cut the airstrip, and ground the garrison down until it fell, and that defeat ended France's war in Indochina. The parallel to a firebase in a bowl of enemy-held peaks, dependent entirely on aircraft, is exact enough to be frightening. If Ripcord is overrun, it will not be a setback. It will be a catastrophe with its own place in history, and the cameras the army has kept away will arrive all at once. And so the 101st Airborne Division does the thing the United States Army did not do in Vietnam. it backs away from a major engagement. The decision falls to the division commander, Major General Sidney Berry, and it is the loneliest kind of command choice, made with what he later described as an absence of guidance from above, weighing the chance to bleed the enemy badly against the risk of losing a battalion and a firebase together. He chooses to pull out, and he takes sole ownership of it. On the 22nd day, with one of Lucas's companies fighting off an entire enemy battalion just to reach an extraction site, the order is given to evacuate Ripcord and destroy it from the air. Pulling several hundred men, their guns and their gear off an exposed hilltop while the enemy surrounds you is among the most dangerous things an army can attempt, and the North Vietnamese have been waiting for exactly this. On the morning of the 23rd, as the lift begins, they hit the base with everything. What follows is a feat of flying that the survivors never forgot. Chinooks drop in to sling out the surviving howitzers. Then U-1 Hueys dart between mortar salvos to lift the troops off the hill 5 men at a time, timing their runs to the gaps in the shelling, while gunships and fighter bombers work the enemy positions to keep them suppressed for the few seconds each landing requires. Lucas does not leave. Throughout the siege he had refused to direct the defense from cover, and during the battle he had already been wounded once, on the 4th of July. Now, on the final morning, he stands in the open, coordinating the evacuation, getting his men onto the helicopters, when a 120 mm mortar round lands at his feet. The blast shatters both his legs. A surgeon gets to him, starts on 4, and discovers who he has been treating only on opening the flak jacket and seeing the silver oak leaf. There is little to be done. Lucas comes awake, jokes weakly, hands his blood-spattered map to the captain taking over, and is loaded onto a Huey escorted by 4 Cobras. He goes into shock on the flight, and takes his last breath as the medics unload him at Camp Evans. He is one of the last men killed at Ripcord, and for standing in that fire to get his battalion out, he is posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. When the last troops are off, the hill is not surrendered, it is erased. B-52 bombers flying the high-altitude saturation strikes known as arc-light are sent to carpet bomb the position the Americans have just abandoned, and for a week afterward every likely route the enemy might use to withdraw is worked over with a relentless round-robin of artillery, airstrikes, and more B-52s. The base, built at such cost in the spring and held at greater cost through July, is bombed into the mountainside within hours of going quiet. Then comes the part of Ripcord that explains why almost no one heard of it for 15 years, and why that number from the start of this story was what it was. The Screaming Eagles lost 74 men killed and more than 400 wounded in the fighting between the 1st and 23rd of July. The 61 that reached the American public was not an accident of the fog of war. Reducing the number made the losses look smaller, and counting only the confirmed dead let the army avoid acknowledging the 13 men still missing on and around the firebase, which would have meant admitting that bodies had been left behind on a hill the army then abandoned. After Hamburger Hill, after Tet, the country had no stomach for another remote mountain traded for blood, and the command understood that the surest way to prevent an outcry was to make sure the full bill never reached the public. Steering the newsman away from Ripcord was not a footnote to the cover-up. It was the cover-up. What the battle accomplished is contested, and the honest answer is that it depends on who is counting. Harrison, who commanded the brigade, argued for the rest of his life that Ripcord was a victory in disguise, that the punishment inflicted on the enemy in those mountains crippled his offensive capacity and helped push the North's next great offensive back from 1971 to 1972. Other historians, Shelby Stanton and Louis Sawley among them, see it the other way. The enemy wanted the Americans off that hill and out of the Ashau, and the enemy got it, forcing the abandonment of the firebase and the cancellation of the offensive it existed to support at a moment when he knew the Americans had neither the will nor the political room to fight back. By that reading, Ripcord was not a costly enemy defeat but a successful enemy operation, a demonstration that even the last full-strength American division could be pushed off ground it meant to hold. The thing that makes the question almost impossible to settle is the very thing the whole war had taught everyone to distrust: the numbers. And here Ripcord turns the usual story of Vietnam on its head. For years, American commanders had inflated enemy body counts because the body count was the metric of success and every incentive pointed toward rounding up. At Ripcord, the 100 first did the opposite. The journals of the units in the siege record only about 125 enemy dead because those were the only ones physically counted. The real figure was certainly far higher given the weight of firepower poured onto those mountains, but the division refused to guess upward. The estimate of heavier enemy losses came not from the men who did the counting, but from the general above them. A conservative estimate of the number of NVA killed, Major General Sidney Berry told the troops, is over 500. So the one battle where the army honestly undercounted the enemy is also the battle where it quietly undercounted its own dead, and for the same underlying reason. By 1970, the truth about Ripcord, in either direction, was politically inconvenient. The enemy count was kept low because the unit would not inflate it. The American count was kept low because the war could not afford it. The figures that should tell us what happened on that hill were shaped at every level by what the country was prepared to hear. For the men who came off that hill, the silence that followed was its own kind of wound. They had fought one of the hardest sustained battles of the entire war, a battle that produced 3 medals of honor and a long list of lesser decorations for valor, and they came home to a country that had been told it was a minor action with light casualties on a hill the army gave up anyway. There were no headlines, no reckoning, no place for Ripcord in the story America was telling itself about leaving Vietnam. The battle simply slid into a gap between the war the public was watching and the war these men had actually fought. It would take until the middle of the 1980s, when the survivors organized themselves into an association and began collecting their own accounts, for the real shape of Ripcord, the true number of dead, the men left behind, the deliberate quieting of it all, to start reaching the public it had been kept from. This is the deeper reason Ripcord vanished. It was not only that the administration feared the headlines, though it did. It was that the battle fit no story anyone wanted to tell about how the war was ending. It was not a triumphant last stand, and it was not a clean withdrawal. It was several hundred soldiers fighting and dying with extraordinary skill to hold a hilltop their own country had quietly decided was not worth holding, in a war their own government had already chosen to leave, and then being officially reduced to a smaller number on the way out the door. The men who survived spent 15 years getting the real figure heard. The hill in the Ashau is jungle again now, as it was before the engineers ever arrived, and the only account of Ripcord that never needed to inflate its body count is the one written by the men who were standing on it.